Hello, 3C. It's me again. I'm back and I'm here to talk to you about the Russian Revolution and connect it with Animal Farm as promised. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest with you, 3C. I am not an expert in Russian history. It's an incredibly complex topic. I got my notes here, kids. I'm going to be referring to the PowerPoint, but I'm not an expert, so I just wanted to say that to you at the beginning of this. I'm going to connect this historical story with the characters and events from Animal Farm, but I just wanted to say to begin with that I'm by no means an expert on Russian history. It's incredibly complicated. And to make it more complicated, it's actually quite a long period that we're going to be talking about. Animal Farm is based on what happened in Russia from the Revolution of 1917 all the way through to Stalin's reign, which didn't end until 1953. So we're talking quite a long period of years there, decades, that we have to cover in order to sort of get a sense of what we're talking about. And in Animal Farm itself, there is a sense of time passing. You know, we're in chapter 8 now, and the animals are saying, sort of having trouble remembering what life was like before the revolution. So there's a sense of time passing in the novel as well. Okay, so in order to understand the revolution, which happened in 1917, you have to understand Russia before the revolution. Now, talking about this is sometimes difficult because there was also another revolution, a sort of failed revolution, I guess, in 1905. So people will talk about more than one revolution when it comes to Russia in the 20th century. But we're talking about the 1917 revolution. Now, Russia at this time was really just primed for revolution, primed for things to really explode. Russia had been, until 1861, a country mostly peopled by what was called serfs. Now, a serf is essentially a slave, so it's a person who's owned by another person. Now, a serf in Russia was owned by the person who owned the land on which they were working. So you were owned by a sort of a very, very wealthy, usually an aristocrat like a lord or a duke or whatever, and they would have this huge property with sometimes tens of thousands of serfs. And you'd had to live in that place your whole life, and if you wanted to get married, you have to ask permission. If you wanted to leave, you had to ask permission, and you really had zero control of your own life, and you were essentially a slave. So up until 1861, 40% of the Russian population were serfs. So that's the context you need to be thinking of. This is a nation until not long before the revolution, where most of the people had essentially been living as slaves. That's an initial context for you to think about. Now, by 1917, serfdom is gone, but we still have a country that's not very industrialized, so most people work on the land, and as farmers, working conditions are really, really poor. We've got high taxes, and of course, in 1917, World War I has already begun. Russia was a part of World War I, but they were doing really, really badly in 1917. You had an absolutist monarchy ruled by a Tsar. Now, a Tsar is the Russian word for like Caesar or emperor. So Russia was ruled by an emperor, the Emperor Nicholas II at this time, and he was incompetent. He was a poor military leader, and he was also bad at running a country sort of administratively day to day. So he didn't know what he was doing, and so Russia goes into World War I, and by 1917, you've got soldiers that have got no bullets and no boots. They're wrapping rags around their feet. So conditions are really, really bad, and Tsar Nicholas is completely incompetent. Now, if you go to the PowerPoint and you look at slide number 12, it's called History versus Fiction, you will see that Tsar Nicholas II is Farmer Jones. Okay, so he's the equivalent of Farmer Jones. And if you skip ahead to slide 14, you will see a picture of Tsar Nicholas II and what he looked like. He was the last Tsar because, of course, revolution, spoiler alert, he loses his throne. And he was all-powerful, essentially. He there was no democracy. There was very little effort to allow people control of their own lives, and there was a big difference in how people lived. So if you look at slide 15, you'll see like he lived in this incredible palace, whereas most of the population were living in terrible conditions. There was very little food. There was a refugee crisis from World War One. There were millions of casualties from World War One. There were these incredibly high prices for food. It was just the populace was so miserable and overworked, underpaid, hungry. It was just, you could not create conditions more ripe for revolution, if you know what I mean. So we get to February 1917. And it's International Women's Day. So International Women's Day is celebrated around the world. It's celebrated around the world. Then, February 1917, and the women of St. Petersburg go out not to celebrate Women's Day, International Women's Day, but they go out to protest. And it's all these women, thousands of women on the street that begin, and they're protesting using International Women's Day as a sort of moment to gather. And these protests about food prices and the war, it spills out beyond St. Petersburg and basically spreads throughout Russia. And that's how and when the revolution began. Now, Tsar Nicholas, they demand that he abdicates. Now, abdicate means to sort of resign from your throne if you're a ruler, if you're a king or a queen. So they demand Tsar Nicholas's resignation and basically start taking steps towards trying to work out, okay, we're not going to be ruled by a king anymore. We don't want an emperor. We want to do something different. We want to have a different way of governing ourselves. And as is always the case, there was lots of different people with lots of different opinions about how this should be done. And so the Bolsheviks, or the communists, were just one group among many who had ideas about what Russia could look like in the future. Many people wanted a constitution. Many people wanted democracy. But there were also people that were heavily influenced by the work of a man called Karl Marx. Now, I've talked to you about Karl Marx on slide 16, so we're now on slide 16 now, and Karl Marx is essentially old major in the story. Now, Marx believed that the workers, so sort of the everyday people, were the real source of wealth in a country. So, it's not it's not that top 1% who own everything that are actually the real strength and power. It's not the pigs, it's Boxer that's doing all the actual work, right? And he believed that the workers are where the wealth really comes from, and it's not fair that they're not getting a share of the profits. So the workers only earn enough to survive, wherein the capitalists, or like the people that sort of own the factories and the farms, they're the ones that are getting all the benefit of all the hard work of the everyday people. So he really believed that capitalism was a really, really bad thing, and that workers should rise up against capitalism, and all things should be sort of shared out equally. So it's no longer that one person has more than somebody else. No, we all work together, we're all equal, and we all get an equal share of what comes back in. So it's essentially a call for equality. And in its sort of core form, communism or socialism is what Karl Marx called it, is still an incredibly beautiful and tempting ideal. However, it becomes something much different in Russia in how it was developed, first by a man called Lenin, and then later by a man called Stalin. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep flicking you around in the slides. I do that in class, and I'm going to do it now, but it's maybe a little bit more awkward when I do it when we're doing this online thing. But I'm going to go back to slide number 12 now, called History versus Fiction, to just talk to you generally about how the characters line up with their historical equivalents before I keep going. Now, I've already said Tsar Nicholas II is Farmer Jones. Okay, so an incompetent, all-powerful leader, like Farmer Jones is in the book, that's Tsar Nicholas in Russia. Now, Old Major is Karl Marx, but then there's also sort of parts of a man called Lenin in Old Major, because Karl Marx had sort of the core idea for socialism, or what would become to be called communism, but it was Lenin that actually put it into practice in the context of Russia. And of course, Old Major has the idea, but he also really sort of lays out what it should look like with, the Beasts of England song, and by talking about his plan. And so I think it's good or smart to think of Lenin as sort of a cross between Old Major and Napoleon. Now, Napoleon has parts of Lenin and also parts of Stalin. So, it's maybe slightly complex in some ways to try and think about it in these terms, but I'm going to go through who Lenin and Stalin were, and so you can get a sense of how they both contribute to the character of Napoleon and how Lenin also contributes to the character of Old Major, just like Karl Marx does. Pardon me. Now, Snowball was a man called Trotsky. He was also a revolutionary, just like Snowball is also a revolutionary alongside Napoleon. And it is Stalin who eventually kicks Trotsky out of Russia, exiles him from Russia after the death of Lenin, just like Napoleon removes Snowball from Animal Farm. Now, at the bottom of that slide, I also have some of the other characters. A few of you have been very interested in Benjamin the donkey. He is an incredibly interesting character. He, I think, is supposed to represent the Russian intellectuals who saw the revolution going wrong, who saw that this incredibly idealistic revolutionary ideal of everybody being equal becomes this terrifying authoritarian regime, which is, where a leader uses violence to control the people. Russian intellectuals saw this coming, but didn't do anything to stop it. So I think that's who Benjamin is supposed to represent, and maybe anyone in Russia who was skeptical about the revolution to begin with, who sort of thought that this is never going to work out or be a positive thing, and felt that they were proven right in the end. Now, Boxer represents working class people and dedicated supporters of the revolution in Russia who remained totally devoted to Lenin and Stalin in spite of all of the evidence that existed that these guys were not actually necessarily out for the best, had the best, intentions. And Squealer represents Molotov, who's another figure in the Russian government, but also sort of generally the propaganda department of the Russian government as well. Okay, now I've talked to you about Tsar Nicholas II. What you really need to know essentially is that he was just really, really bad at his job. He didn't want to give up any of his power. He wasn't good at running a country administratively or as a military leader, and just exactly like Farmer Jones, right? Farmer Jones didn't want to give up his farm to the animals, but at the same time he wasn't good at being a farmer. Remember in the book, initially he was sort of okay at it, but then he started drinking too much and he wasn't feeding them, and all these things were going on that weren't nice. Okay, now the revolution begins, 1917. Tsar Nicholas is out, he's in house arrest, he ends up getting shot in his basement with his whole family 2 years after the revolution, which is a really sad and terrible story. If I can put some links on Moodle about it if you're interested. It is an interesting story, though a sad one. And he never regains power, in spite of the fact that some people do try and get him to come back. And so we have this time in Russia in which it's very hopeful. Everyone's very optimistic about Russia's future, and there's all these different people from different political backgrounds saying this is what Russia could look like, this is what we could do. And one of those people is Lenin. Lenin had been exiled. He'd been repeatedly exiled for things like protesting against the government, against the Tsar. But once the Tsar is overthrown, he returns back to Russia, and everyone's celebrating his return. And he leads the Bolsheviks. Now, the Bolsheviks were a sort of militant wing of the Marxist socialist movement. So they were part of this movement towards socialism, so sort of supporting the ideals of Karl Marx. But Lenin always had, even in these early days, a sort of dark side. He believed that violence was necessary to ensure that the revolution continues down the right path, according to him. So he really believed that violence was necessary. A provisional government was put in, which was led by a man called Kerensky. Now, he doesn't have any direct... there's no character that represents him in the book as such, but he was pro-democracy and really those ideas of old majors wherein, everyone's working together and everyone's getting their vote in those meetings. That's sort of the Kerensky side of things. That everybody should get to have their opinion in this. He was a middle of the way kind of guy, but he got thrown out by the Bolsheviks, and through a lot of violence and manipulation and backstabbing and some attempt at democracy, but then ignoring the results of all this drama, and it's a very complicated story. Eventually, the Bolsheviks sort of come out on top. It does lead to a civil war, which we don't necessarily see a comparison to an Animal Farm. There's no civil war between the animals. It's just, old Major has his dream, and then they kick out Farmer Jones, and then basically the pigs take over pretty easily. It was much more complex in Russia, of course, but we have a civil war where basically the Bolsheviks killed anyone who didn't agree with them. And anyone who didn't want to be a Bolshevik or didn't like Lenin's ideas sort of united in what was called the White Movement, but they didn't have a sort of brilliant, charismatic leader. And it was really, and this is the time when Trotsky really, led the Bolsheviks to victory. So this could be a link to what happens with Snowball and the Battle of the Cowshed. Trotsky really showed his strengths in this time. If you go to slide 17, you'll see a picture of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, as I've said, is Snowball. He was, a brilliant man. He was highly intellectual. He was incredibly eloquent, and as I said, he led the Red Army, so the communists, the Bolsheviks, to victory against the White armies who basically just didn't like the Bolsheviks, and it was his sort of brilliant military and organizational prowess that made that happen. And we saw that in the Battle of the Cowshed, right, with Snowball. Like, he was the one who had the plan for the battles. He's the one who led everybody to victory. So he really was the hero of that. Though, of course, now we're getting further into the book, you'll see how Napoleon is rewriting history and pretending that Snowball actually wasn't a hero, that he was really a coward, that he was against the revolution all along, and the same lies were told by Stalin about Trotsky later on in the story. So Trotsky and Stalin disagreed on Russia's future. They disagreed on everything, just like Napoleon and Snowball disagree in the book about everything. Eventually, though, Stalin, while nowhere near as brilliant or as eloquent as Trotsky, was just better at the backroom dealing, better at getting votes, better at sort of manipulating people and networking, and he very quickly got control of the secret police, just like Napoleon secretly gets those dogs, secretly raises them to be obedient to him, and then uses the dogs to chase Snowball at the farm. That is a very simplified version of what happened to Trotsky. So Trotsky was traced away by the KGB, the Russian secret police, and ended up fleeing, and he traveled all around the world, but he was never safe, and ended up actually getting assassinated in 1940s. So he never was able to escape Stalin, even though he left the country. Okay, so I feel like I'm sort of rambling and jumping around, but I have so much information in my head 3C that I'm struggling to make sure I get it all to you. So we've got Russia before the revolution, Russia during the revolution, and the Civil War. So very simple parallels to Animal Farm. And then once Lenin is there and he's taken control, just like when Napoleon has taken control, and we've got the pigs, just like the pigs in the book, he used violence to establish and maintain his power, which is exactly what the pigs did in the book. Some important things for you to know about Lenin, which I think I'm going to just stop here. I'm at 19 minutes, which means I've already rambled for some time. I'm going to stop it here. I'm going to upload this part of the video, and then I'm going to talk about Lenin and Stalin and continue to link it to Animal Farm in the next part of this video. So I will see you in a minute.